If a researcher in a lab coat told you to deliver a potentially lethal electric shock to a total stranger, you would say no. Right.
I mean, you'd certainly like to think so.
Right. But what if I told you that like 2 out of 3 people listening to this right now would actually press the button?
It is a genuinely terrifying statistic when you really look at it.
It really is. And, well, welcome to another deep dive. Today we are exploring the invisible social forces that dictate our behavior, looking at how incredibly susceptible you are to outside pressures, even when you think you're acting completely independently.
We are dissecting a behavioral landscape that is, heavily scripted by everyone else in the room.
Exactly. And we are pulling all of our insights today from one specific source. We'll be looking at section 12.4 of chapter 12 from Psychology 2E.
It's a fantastic section.
It is. And to really unpack the mechanics of this, I'll be stepping into the role of the curious student today, asking all the questions, while you take on the role of the lecturer, kind of guiding you, the listener, and me through the material.
I am very happy to put on the lecturer hat for this one. It's a phenomenal section of text that moves from the basic mechanisms of peer pressure all the way into the complex and often dangerous mechanics of group mentality.
So let's start with the pool of the crowd. I think most of us listening are somewhat familiar with Solomon Asch's conformity experiments from the 1950s.
Yeah, that's a classic Psychology 101 staple.
Right. The setup is pretty simple. A participant has to match a target line. I think they called it line X to 3 options, line A, B, or C.
Exactly. It was an incredibly easy, unambiguous task.
The catch is they are surrounded by a room full of Confederates people working for the researcher who are giving intentionally wrong answers.
And the famous punchline here, the shocking statistic from section 12.4, is that 76% of participants conform to the wrong answer at least once.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why on earth would someone agree with something their own eyes tell them is wrong? It's like wearing a winter coat in July just because your friends are.
That is a great analogy. The textbook actually breaks this down into 2 distinct psychological mechanisms. The first one, which is really what drove the Asch experiment, is called normative social influence.
Normative social influence. So what does that actually mean in practice?
Think of it as a desire to fit in and avoid ridicule. You conform to the group norm because you want to be accepted.
So it's basically peer pressure.
Exactly. You know the line length is wrong, but the internal discomfort of being the odd one out is just so strong that you go along with the crowd anyway.
Wow. So you just cave to the social pressure.
Yeah. But then there's the second mechanism, which is informational social influence. This is when you conform because you genuinely believe the group has better information than you do.
Oh, right. Like you assume everyone else knows something you don't.
Precisely. The textbook gives a great example of this. Imagine you're in a movie theater and you suddenly see smoke coming in under an emergency exit door.
I would probably panic.
Well, you might, but initially it's ambiguous, right? Is it a fire or is it just a special effect for the movie? So what do? You look around at the other people in the theater.
Oh, I see. If everyone else is just calmly eating popcorn, I'm going to assume it's nothing and stay in my seat.
Exactly. But if they start running for the exits, you're going out right behind them. That's informational social influence.
What's fascinating to me is the tipping point of all this conformity. Because we naturally assume that a massive crowd creates massive pressure, right?
What's fascinating here is that Asch found that the size of the majority absolutely matters, but only up to a certain point.
Right, it doesn't just scale up indefinitely.
No, it increases conformity up to about 7 individuals. But after that, adding more voices doesn't really change the outcome. It just levels off.
But the wild part is how fragile that majority actually is.
Oh, incredibly fragile. Asch discovered that if you have just one other dissenter in that room, just one person who gives the correct answer, conformity drops to near 0.
Just having one ally completely breaks the spell.
Yeah, having just one person agree with your reality gives you the psychological cover to trust your own eyes again. And another huge factor is whether your response is public or private.
Oh, right. The textbook mentions that writing an answer down in private pretty much destroys that normative influence.
It does, which is exactly why government elections use secret voting booths. You don't have to face the social judgment of your peers when you cast your ballot.
So, just to synthesize this, if you change your vote publicly to match the crowd, but privately you still disagree, that's called compliance, right?
Exactly. Compliance is a specific form of conformity where you go along with a request or demand even if you fundamentally disagree with it on the inside.
Well, if we scale that up, I mean, if people are willing to comply over something as trivial as the length of a line on a card, what happens when the pressure shifts from just peer pressure to a direct authority figure?
That takes us into some pretty dark territory.
Yeah, it really does. If people conform over lines, what happens when an authority figure demands they do something actively harmful? That leads us to Stanley Milgram's famous experiment.
Right. And it's important to note the historical context here. Milgram's work was sparked by the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, who famously claimed he was just following orders.
That defense really shook people. So Milgram set up this experiment where the participant is assigned the role of the teacher, and a Confederate enactor is the learner.
And the setup was that the teacher had to administer escalating electric shocks to the learner for every wrong answer on a memory test.
Escalating all the way up to 450 volts, which is labeled as extremely dangerous.
Exactly.
Wait, I have to push back here as the student. The learners in this setup were literally crying out in pain, right? They were complaining of heart trouble. Surely people stopped when they heard that.
You would hope so. But here is the really dark truth from section 12.4. A staggering 65% of participants delivered the maximum voltage.
65%. That is just wow.
Just because the researcher in the room told them to continue.
But Milgram didn't just stop there, did he? He tested the boundaries of this obedience to see what would make people finally stop.
He did. He wanted to see how changing the variables affected obedience. And he found that when the humanity of the victim increased, or the power of the authority decreased, obedience dropped significantly.
So how did he decrease the authority?
Well, initially it was done at Yale University, but when he moved the experiment off campus to a regular office building, maximum obedience dropped to 48%.
Because it didn't have that intimidating Ivy League prestige anymore.
Right. And what about the proximity to the victim? When the learner was placed in the exact same room as the teacher, obedience dropped to 40%.
Still terrifyingly high, but lower. When if they actually had to touch them?
That was the biggest drop in the room variations. When the teacher had to physically touch the learner's hand to force it onto the shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%.
So actually feeling the person you're hurting makes it way harder to just blindly follow orders.
Yes. And on the flip side, what if you distance the authority figure? When the researcher gave orders over the phone instead of being in the room, obedience dropped all the way to 23%.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because it's easy to look at Milgram's work and think, oh, that was the 1960s. People were more rigid back then.
It is tempting to dismiss it as mid-century history.
Right. But this isn't just history. Does this actually hold up today?
Sadly, yes. The textbook shares a modern example from a 2008 study by Martin and Bull.
Oh, the midwife study.
Yes. They looked at junior midwives, highly trained modern medical professionals. They asked these midwives to privately state their best practices for certain procedures.
Okay, so they know exactly what the right thing to do is.
Exactly. But then a senior supervisor explicitly told them to do something that went against those very best practices.
And what happened?
The majority of them obeyed the supervisor. They went against their own privately stated clinical judgments simply because a senior authority figure told them to.
That is wild. They knew it was wrong, but the authority was just too much pressure. So we've seen how individuals buckle under group pressure and authority pressure. Now, I want to shift gears and examine what happens when an entire group is tasked with making a decision together. Does the group balance things out, or does it make it worse?
Well, unfortunately, it often makes things worse through something called groupthink.
Groupthink? That sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It does, but it's a real psychological phenomenon. Groupthink is when a group prioritizes harmony and consensus over actual sound decision-making.
So they just want everyone to get along and agree, rather than finding the best solution.
Exactly. The textbook uses a historical example to illustrate this, the U.S. government's 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Okay, and just to be clear for the listener, we are looking at this strictly as the textbook's example of groupthink, not taking any political stance on it.
Right, exactly. Impartially reporting the text here. The example notes that advisors agreed on the presence of weapons of mass destruction despite having doubts, because the momentum of the group pushed for consensus, and obviously that had devastating consequences.
So what are the actual symptoms of groupthink? How do you know you're in it?
There are a few key symptoms. First, there's an illusion of invincibility. The group thinks they can't possibly fail.
Oh, that's dangerous.
Very. Then there's self-censorship, where members keep their doubts to themselves. They also actively quash any dissent that does pop up.
So if someone speaks out, they get shut down.
Yes, and they also shield their leaders from contradictory information.
Wow. This raises an important question, though. If a group is naturally wired to do this, how do we prevent it?
It takes deliberate effort. You have to institute things like voting in private so people don't feel normative pressure.
Right. Back to the secret ballots.
Exactly. You also need to actively seek outside opinions from people who aren't caught up in the group's internal dynamics and rigorously weigh the costs and benefits of every option.
You really have to force friction into the process.
You do. Which brings us to a related concept, group polarization.
Group polarization. How is that different from groupthink?
Group polarization is what happens when a group's initial attitude actually strengthens and becomes more extreme after they discuss it among themselves.
Wait, so if we all kind of agree on something, talking about it makes us agree even harder.
Exactly. If the group leans slightly one way, discussing, it acts as an echo chamber, and they end up taking a much more extreme position than any of them held individually.
So group polarization is basically like an algorithm on social media, but happening in real life.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Like, if my friends think someone is attractive and we sit around talking about it, their agreement essentially brainwashes me into thinking that person is even more attractive than I originally thought.
Yes, exactly. And on a larger scale, the text notes how this mechanism drives extreme political partisanship today.
Oh, totally. People just self-select their media and friend groups.
Right. They create these self-selected media diets and social circles that create incredibly hostile attitudes. The text even points out that in some cases, this political polarization can rival or exceed racial discrimination.
That is terrifying, just trapping ourselves in these echo chambers. And the textbook briefly mentions social traps in this context too, right?
Yes, social traps are fascinating. It's when groups or individuals act in their own short-term self-interest, but by doing so, they create long-term negative consequences for everyone.
Like the Cold War nuclear arms race.
Exactly. Both sides acted in their short-term interest to build more weapons for defense, but it created a massive long-term threat for the entire planet.
Man, groups can really mess with our decision-making.
They really can.
But having explored how groups make our decisions more extreme, I want to pivot to how being in a group changes our actual individual work ethic. Like, what happens when we have to perform tasks together?
Well, that introduces us to a very relatable concept called social loafing.
Social loafing. This sounds like the classic dread of the group project.
That is exactly what it is. Social loafing is when a person does less work because their individual effort isn't being evaluated separately from the group.
Because they can just hide in the crowd.
Exactly. The text notes that college students are actually the worst offenders when it comes to social loafing.
I am not surprised by that at all.
Interestingly, though, women and people from collectivistic cultures are less likely to loaf.
Oh, that makes sense. They might value the group's success more than individual coasting. So how do we fix this? How do teachers stop students from loafing?
Well, the textbook mentions the flocking method.
The flocking method.
Yeah, it's when instructors assign students to groups based on their schedules and their motivations, rather than letting them self-select.
Oh, so you can't just group up with your friends and slack off together.
Exactly. It breaks up those comfortable dynamics that allow people to hide.
But there's a really surprising flip side to this, right?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes. Social loafing happens when a task is easy, but what if the task is difficult?
Wait, if it's hard, wouldn't people want to loaf even more?
You'd think so, but the dynamic completely reverses. When a task is difficult and your individual performance isn't being evaluated, that lack of pressure actually reduces your anxiety. Because you aren't terrified of failing publicly as an individual, you relax, and that actually helps you perform better.
So what does this all mean? Groups can make us lazy on easy tasks because we can coast, but highly effective on hard tasks because the anonymity takes the pressure off.
That is exactly the takeaway. Anonymity in a group can be a double-edged sword. Which brings us to the final concept from section 12.4, de-individuation.
De-individuation. That sounds like losing yourself entirely.
It literally is. De-individuation is the loss of accountability and sense of self when you feel anonymous in a crowd.
Like being in a massive stadium or a dark concert.
Exactly. When you strip away a person's individual identity, they often adopt the primal momentum of the group. This is the exact mechanism that leads to mob behaviors or riots.
Because the individual rules and morals just vanish and the crowd's energy takes over.
Precisely. You stop thinking as an autonomous agent and just become part of the swarm.
Well, as the student in this equation today, I have to thank you for this masterclass on social psychology.
It was my pleasure.
And for you listening, I hope this helps you see how incredibly flexible our thoughts, our work ethics, and even our moral compasses really are, depending entirely on who's in the room with us.
It is definitely eye-opening to realize how influenced we are by our surroundings.
It really is. And I want to end with a provocative final thought for you to ponder, something that builds on everything we've talked about today.
I'd love to hear it.
As we move deeper into an era of remote work, virtual reality, and anonymous online avatars, how will the rules of social influence change?
Oh, that is a great question.
Will the physical distance of the digital world buffer us from the Asch effect and blind obedience? Or will the total anonymity of the internet lead to unprecedented levels of de-individuation and group polarization?
It's a terrifying possibility.
It really is. The virtual groups you are participating in right now might be rewiring your brain without you even noticing. So think about that the next time you log on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.